Mr. Herman didn't say that he got the wish of a lifetime by tossing a coin. He said, felt that he was really out there on the football field. When we investigate the foreign policy of any state, we find, first of all, an official doctrine that attributes to state policy honorable intent, though occasional failure, due primarily to the machinations of evil enemies. Thus, Soviet propaganda proclaims the commitment of the Soviet Union to peace, democracy, and human rights, describes the Soviet posture as defensive, and identifies U.S. imperialism as the prime source of disorder and suffering throughout the world. Official U.S. doctrine is the mirror image, and the pattern is far more pervasive, if not universal. If we investigate further, we regularly discover that official doctrine is quite inconsistent with the historical and documentary record. In our case, we are fortunate to have access to a rich documentary record for earlier years. We discover, not surprisingly, that it conforms to the pattern of evolving events and is entirely inconsistent with widely proclaimed doctrine. Now, I cannot hope to establish these conclusions in a few minutes. Rather, I'll try to sketch the main outlines of what I believe you will discover if you explore the record on your own, as I very much hope you will. I'll focus on Central America and the Middle East in the post-World War II period, but the record for earlier years and other regions is much the same. The United States emerged from World War II in a position of global power with few, if any, historical precedents, and U.S. elites were well aware of the fact. Through the 1940s, they carried out sophisticated geopolitical planning, which is on record, to fashion a global order that would be responsive to their interests. During the war, top State Department planners carried out extensive studies with the Council on Foreign Relations to develop the general outlines of global policy, later applied to particular regions. They developed the concept of what they called the Grand Area. The Grand Area was to be a region subordinated to the needs of the American economy in a framework of liberal internationalism in which it was plausibly assumed U.S. interests would dominate. The Grand Area was outlined in detail. It was to include, at a minimum, the Far East, the Western Hemisphere, and the former British Empire, including the energy reserves of the Middle East, which the State Department described as, I'm quoting, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment, referring to Saudi Arabia. At a maximum, the Grand Area should become a world system under U.S. control. Now, the Grand Area had a structure. The industrial powers were to be reconstituted, but under U.S. control and in a manner acceptable to the United States, a commitment with many significant consequences. It was understood that Europe and Japan required a hinterland. State Department studies, now declassified, explain that the Third World was to fulfill its function as a source of raw materials and markets for the industrial capitalist powers and was to be exploited, as they put it, for their reconstruction. With regard to Latin America, George Kennan, who was one of the most influential of post-war planners, explained in internal discussion that a prime concern is the protection of our raw materials. More generally, he observed that we have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6% of its population, and we must maintain this disparity to the extent possible by force if necessary, putting aside vague and idealistic slogans such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization, preferring police states, if needed, over democracies that might be too liberal and too indulgent to what were called communists. The latter term has lost any substantive meaning in U.S. political rhetoric, referring simply to anyone who stands in our way. These are all quotes. These are all quotes, incidentally. The declassified documents on U.S. foreign policy in Latin America apply these ideas in detail. They explain that the primary threat we face in Latin America, I'm continuing to quote, is the trend toward nationalistic regimes that respond to popular demand for improvement in low living standards and production for domestic needs. Now, that's unacceptable because the United States is committed to, quote, encouraging a climate conducive to private investment, in particular guarantees for opportunity to earn, and in the case of foreign capital, to repatriate a reasonable return. We must therefore oppose what is regularly called ultranationalism in secret documents. That means efforts to pursue domestic needs. We must foster export-oriented production in the interest of U.S. investors. Now, it is recognized that such programs have very little appeal to the Latin American public, so the conclusion is the natural one. We must therefore gain control over the military, which can in turn control domestic opposition and overthrow civilian governments if necessary. We must also act to overcome the excessive liberalism of the Latin American countries. These ideas are outlined in the high-level documents and were applied in practice in Latin America as elsewhere. If some group or country succumbs to ultranationalism, it must be disciplined by the local security forces under U.S. control if possible, or by direct U.S. subversion or aggression. And the modern history of Latin America is to a significant extent an application of these doctrines. So a brief experiment in capitalist democracy in Guatemala was terminated in 1954 by a CIA coup installing a murderous terror state that has been maintained by regular U.S. intervention to block elections and to conduct regular repression and massacre. These operations reached a peak in the past decade with perhaps 100,000 people killed and innumerable others tortured, maimed, and starved, all of this enthusiastically supported by the Reagan administration. Meanwhile, Honduras was turned into a U.S. military base with increasing human rights violations, reaching several assassinations a week last year, and hundreds of thousands of peasants starving to death while the country exports snow peas and beef for U.S. markets, that being a typical consequence of the U.S.-imposed aid and development model. In El Salvador, in the late 1970s, there was a proliferation of popular organizations, largely church-based, that threatened to lay the basis for meaningful democracy and social reforms. The Archbishop pleaded with the United States government not to send aid to the junta because it would be used, he said, to destroy the people's organizations fighting to defend their fundamental human rights. The security forces backed by the United States overcame the threat of democracy and social reform by terror and slaughter, murdering the political opposition, assassinating the Archbishop, physically destroying the independent media, invading and largely destroying the university, slaughtering tens of thousands of peasants, union leaders and others, killing priests and nuns and intellectuals or driving them out of the country, to which they still cannot return for fear of torture and assassination. When the population was considered to be sufficiently traumatized, a so-called election was held in an atmosphere of terror and despair, macabre rumor and grisly reality, in the words of the British parliamentary human rights group that observed it. I should add that it's a staple of independent scholarship that, I quote now, while paying lip service to the encouragement of representative democracy in Latin America, the United States has a strong interest in just the reverse, apart from formal elections that are often farcical, and that the alleged U.S. concern for democracy when proper conditions have been established by repression and violence or simply control of resources, that is only a tactical device to ensure the dominance of, quote, private capitalistic enterprise linked to the United States. I'm quoting from Gordon Connell Smith in the Major Study of the Inter-American System, published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. As the leading U.S. academic scholar on human rights in Latin America has put it, the goal of the military authoritarian regimes sponsored by the United States has been to destroy permanently a perceived threat to the existing structure of socioeconomic privilege by eliminating the political participation of the numerical majority, principally the working or popular classes. That's what we call democracy. In the case of Nicaragua, as George Shultz frankly explained, the concern was that Sandinista success might embolden others to seek radical solutions to their problems unacceptable to the United States. Therefore, the United States followed what in fact is quite a traditional pattern, attempting to force Nicaragua into the Soviet orbit by military attack, pressures on allies and international lending institutions to refuse military and other aid, economic warfare that had a lethal effect in a desperately poor country, ideological warfare here and abroad, including Nicaragua, where the U.S. in fact dominates the media in much of the country. The purpose was to abort the early successes of the Sandinista revolution in health, welfare, and development, and to ensure that the virus of independent development does not infect the region, to use the standard terms of, in this case, Henry Kissinger and others. There have been numerous other examples over the years. Now, policy does vary. So at the hawkish extreme, we have the Reaganites, who favor force over diplomacy and thunder that negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table, and that the purpose of our aid is to permit people who are fighting on our side to use more violence. That's George Shultz and Elliott Abrams, respectively. At the dovish extreme, we find Robert Pastor, who was Director of Latin American Affairs for the National Security Council under Carter. He explains that, quoting, "The United States did not want to control Nicaragua or other nations of the region, but it also did not want to allow developments to get out of control. It wanted Nicaraguans to act independently, except when doing so would affect U.S. interests adversely. Thus, Latin Americans should be free to choose as we wish them to choose." Again, what we call democracy. In practice, when they choose otherwise, we resort to what our friends in the Salvadoran military call the pedagogy of terror, sometimes in extreme forms, as under the Reagan administration, which is responsible for atrocities that merit comparison to Pol Pot. Turning briefly to the Middle East, the primary concern was the same: the fear that indigenous nationalism might threaten our effective control over one of the greatest material prizes in world history. That was understood since the 1940s to provide us with leverage over Europe and Japan. The National Security Council recognized in 1958 that, quoting, "a logical corollary of our opposition to radical nationalism would be support for Israel as a loyal ally." Now, this conception of Israel as a strategic asset became established in ways I can't review here, particularly under the Nixon Doctrine, with Israel and Iran under the Shah assigned the role of cops on the beat, as the Defense Secretary Melvin Laird put it at the time. Israel also increasingly came to provide services for U.S. power in Africa and Asia, but particularly in Latin America, as in Central America over the past decade, where Israel has served, in effect, as a mercenary state within the impressive international terror network that was partially exposed during the Iran-Contra hearings. These are the essential factors that have led the United States to block a political settlement to the Arab-Israeli conflict since 1971, a settlement that's backed by a broad international consensus that favors a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized borders, based on the principle that the indigenous population of the former Palestine and the Jewish settlers who largely displaced them both have the right of national self-determination. Now, such a settlement, which has long been feasible, is opposed by Khomeini, by Gaddafi, by the United States and Israel. U.S.-Israeli power has been decisive in blocking it. This policy, not too well understood here, but easily documented from the record, and traceable back to Henry Kissinger, that guarantees further escalation of the cycle of harsh repression, resistance, more repression and more resistance in the occupied territories, with the likelihood of regional wars and possible superpower confrontation, as has repeatedly threatened since 1967. Now, these are, I think, the main outlines of what you will discover if you review the ample documentary and historical record, a record that is very remote from official pieties, as we regularly discover in investigating international affairs and their ideological cover.